Good morning, everybody. I'm kind of coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective. I'm an army of one, and most of my clients are the end user, and it is a very direct. I've got a very direct line to them. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, kind of where I came from, what I do, why I do it, and then, time permitting, at the end, a run-through of the process that I go through in doing what I'm doing. My formal training is in graphic design and advertising, and I spent about 10 years working in that industry. There were some really amazing people that I got to work with, great industry, but as time went on, I felt my soul being sucked out of me, and recognized that I needed to get out of it. And that's kind of what this story is about, really, is how I transitioned from my first love of making things. And that's really what drives me. I have a pretty inherent need to just make stuff, and with my hands, not just theoretical making. Physically, getting my hands dirty, mucky, making stuff, getting cuts, bruises, all that kind of stuff. There's a real tangible interaction that I really, really enjoy and need to have. And the design world was allowing for less and less of that. So that is sort of what prompted me to leave it, was to get back to what I love, making things, and in all aspects. So from the 30,000-foot view thinking process of how do you approach it, right down to the actual physical making of a single object. So I want to kind of go through a little bit of kind of how that happened. I was living in Toronto, and when I walked away from the design world, we moved to Kitchener and thought, you know what, if we're going to do this, I'm going to live the dream. So that's my workshop, which is in my backyard. It is a marvelous space to work in, and come up a number of times now, surrounding yourself with beautiful things that are inspirational. That was part of it. I have a very good friend who's an architect, and she helped me with the building. It was worth the expense to help me figure out how to make my very personal space as efficient as I possibly could. It's, like I said, it's in my backyard. I went from an hour-long commute in Toronto down to a 50-foot commute. In the winter, I can take the luge run. I'm not sure if you can see, but there is a luge run in there that we build with our kids that it's a nice way to get to work. That's the main floor of my studio. It's full of very large equipment, lots of wood, lots of materials, beautiful equipment, and beautiful stuff. That's the second floor. I spend most of my time on the second floor, but both are used as my own space. I also am a home renovator. That's our living room and our dining room, which was totally gutted and rebuilt. I couldn't find anybody who could do a herringbone floor, so you have to learn how to do a herringbone floor. So you put it in. I'm also a furniture maker. This is going back 20 years or so. This is what started me as a creative outlet for making stuff. Furniture really, really resonated with me because there's a really interesting blend of tactile qualities that you have to have. You're interacting with it. Your entire body is interacting with it. And how do you make that? If it fails, a crappy chair is a crappy chair. Your butt gets sore and it's not comfortable. And so there's a lot of challenges to fit all those parameters that are involved in what makes a chair really good. There's some really small margins of room that will be a successful chair or a failed chair. And I've got a time window here. This is actually one of the chairs that I made a number of years ago. And if anybody wants, you're welcome to come down and sit in it. Again, this is an experience. This is part of a user's experience. So feel free. I can move it up a little higher if you want. Feel free to sit in it for a few minutes, however long you want. Try it out. It's a chair. I had to clean off some mashed potatoes from it from the last time we used it. I'm also a tool maker, and the theme here is, if you're probably already seeing, is I was making furniture, and the tools I was using were no longer adequate. So it was time to make my own tools for my own use. And that then spawned what I've been doing for the last 12 years, which is a plane maker. So that's an example of a plane that I'd made. I'm also making guitars because there's a link between a lot of the materials that I use to make planes and a lot of the materials that are used in guitars. And well, a guitar is not that different than making a plane. It's a very precise instrument and requires an awful lot of attention and dedication, but it's just as rewarding. And what sort of happens as time goes on, as you start just making stuff, you realize that you start looking at everything and thinking, I can probably make that. And so it can get you into trouble sometimes, but you start looking at the world very differently, and things that you start seeing shortcomings of things, or things that you're interacting with that you don't enjoy anymore. You go, I think I can probably tweak that. So you run off to or I run off to the shop and twiddle around and come up with something and change it. It's a really fun way of exploring making stuff. So that's really quickly what it is, or some of the things that I've done. In preparing for this, I realized that there are some really big picture themes that I've, I guess, identified over a couple of years that I think are worth mentioning. One of them is that 100% effort is required in everything. With a goal, the bar, you throw the bar as high as you possibly can. 80% doesn't cut the mustard. If your goal is to get 80%, you will only ever get 80%. Aim as high as you possibly can. It's the only way to get there. The other thing that I was very interested in is, what are my limitations? What can I do? What can I not do? And that's also coupled with the 100% effort. Just knowing, where is my ceiling? What am I capable of doing? It's a pretty important thing. One other aspect that I grew up learning both from my father and my industrial arts teacher in high school was, have no fear of trying something new. What's the worst thing that can happen is you screw it up. And it seems a little strange, but with that attitude, I found myself trying all sorts of things, in some ways really naively, and you can figure out a lot of workarounds. I have no metalworking experience other than what I've learned on my own. My approach to metalworking was, this is a strange wood with strange properties. And you start trying stuff that, I get a lot of machinists that when I go to shows, they look at this hand plane, they're looking at these, graceful curves, and they're asking me, oh, how did you calculate for spring back when you bent that? And they're looking for a mathematical reason or a process of how to do that. And I always say, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but I just hammer it until it's the right shape, and then it's done. And I'm just literally lining it up with the curve it has to follow. I mean, it's not complicated. But I think part of that lack of education and that lack of training as a machinist has afforded me some really curious routes to finding a solution to something. Another really important one is learning to see, learning to be critical of your own work. Being able to step back from it, look at it, and say, there's nothing I can add to this to make it better, and there's nothing I can take away. It is just, that takes a long time to learn. When I was in design school, every Friday we would critique all of our stuff. We'd all throw up all of our boards, what we'd done during the week, stick it on the board. Everybody takes shots at it. In the first week, everybody gets vicious and mean and nasty. But after a while, you realize this is actually a really, really important skill to learn, is how do you evaluate with real, tangible language when something is successful. And if somebody did a great job, just say, that's great, and leave it alone. You don't need to try and pick it apart and find something wrong with it. But if you do it constructively, it can be a really good learning opportunity. And then to turn that on yourself and then look at your own work objectively. It's really easy to look at what you've done and you go, wow, that's really beautiful and awesome. But then step back and try and figure out, what could I do better? What could I improve on it? The most important thing for me has always been learning to use my hands. And that lesson, as I was preparing for this, I kept trying to figure out, well, when did that actually happen? When did my skills with using my hands, when did that start? And I had to go back really, really far. When I was a kid up at the cottage, we would go fishing a lot, and I'd always say, Dad, can I clean the fish for supper tonight? And I remember the one time he said, if you can successfully fillet a rock bass, which I don't know if any of you know what it is, it's all bone. There's no real meat on it. So he said, if you can successfully fillet a rock bass, then you can clean the fish for supper. And so I don't know how many sad, poor rock bass I tried to fillet, but I finally got there. And the other thing that did was just instill a sense of confidence that you can do something that might otherwise, it's a completely new experience that I had learning how to do that, but it's carried me over the years of just doing new stuff and not being afraid to try something new. Again, my dad and I shoveling gravel. When's the last time anybody's used a shovel? Like actually, oh great. That's good actually, because I've got a friend who runs a children's camp and they had a bunch of staff up there and they had to dig a hole. And it was a bunch of 19 and 20-year-old kids and Leanne was lamenting the fact that they couldn't dig a hole. They did not know how to use a shovel, which seems ludicrous to me. So for all of you out there who've used this shovel, great. But if I'm going to assign anything, go back home and actually use a shovel, a real proper spade, and dig a hole, just for the experience of doing it. Because there's a connection that you get from manual labor that's really, I think, really valuable. It makes things very tangible and real. Drywalling, in the shot of our living room, again, you get to the point where it reaches critical mass, where you've done so much stuff with your hands, you start not really you can think you can do anything. And so you start doing drywall, you start doing all sorts of other stuff because the skills that you're training your eye and your hands to connect with one another. And you can start taking on all sorts of stuff that you may not have had experience with. One of the really rewarding parts about this, when I look back on growing up and doing a lot of stuff, that's my son, my oldest son, and his friend, and this was again in that living room, and I was plastering, and they came down, and Tycho, Riley's friend, said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm doing the drywalling." He said, "Well, that looks interesting," and so I said, "Here, grab." It was an opportunity for me to give them some exposure in how to do something. And they did all the drywall screw holes that they could reach in the entire room. And Tycho's dad came by, and he didn't want to leave. He'd never done it before, and his dad he's a great guy, and he just said, "I got to send him over here more often because I don't have any experience doing any of this kind of stuff. And this is really neat." And he was completely and 100% engaged in that activity. The other thing is this is about wood and wood as a material. I've got a bit of a problem. I mean, I don't know if you could tell from the shots of the shop, but there's wood everywhere. And I have a bit of a collecting problem with it. And it's beside the shop. I've got some offsite storage. It's everywhere. But I keep running into these amazing, amazing materials. And they are stunningly beautiful. They are beautiful to look at. They're beautiful to work with. They smell great. And it is, talking about inspiration, you get a ugly looking 100-year-old log and you cut into it and you open it up and that's what you get. It's awesome. That is an unedited Photoshop picture of a piece of wood. It is electric magenta when you first cut into it. And so I open that up and I feel quite deeply compelled that I want to do this piece of wood justice. I do not want to screw it up, and I want to create something beautiful with it. For me, a lot of this focus is beautiful. Everything that you create should be beautiful. There's no excuse for ugly, really. I mean, there are constraints that you run up against, financial constraints and all sorts of other things. But at the end of the day, try and make it beautiful because the world is full of ugly. I've also realized, too, that so much of this, and this has come up a number of times already this morning, so much of this has to do with relationships. And really, what I've realized now is I've been really lucky to have some really close personal friendships and relationships. My first customer was a woman that I met at a furniture making conference. And she has since become a very, very good friend to the point where every summer we go to stay at their place in Ottawa on their farm. That's a picture of our two boys in the back of her VW bus on Canada Day watching the fireworks. So that line between client and friend for me has gotten so blurry over the years, and it's marvelous. It is such an amazing thing to be able to work so directly with customers, with the end user. I would not trade it for the world. One of customer number 3, actually, again, going back to it's come up, the financial side of things. So I'm working in the advertising world, and it's wearing me down, frankly, at this stage. And I get this customer who makes arrangements to buy this plane, commission this plane, and he says, I've sent 4 post-dated checks to you for $500 each because I know you're a new business, and I hope that'll help your cash flow situation. And so I've got this one world where you've got people sending you stuff, calling you saying, that design campaign that we've been sitting on for 2 months, we need it Monday morning. You got to work the weekend and get it done. So I got that world, and then I got this other world where I've got customers who I've never met personally who are that thoughtful about their impact on me and the relationship that we have, that they're sending me post-dated checks. Ditch this. I got to get a whole lot more of that as far as fulfillment of life goes. My approach to design in a lot of ways is a lot about craft as opposed to, there is some analysis that happens in it, but one of the reasons I left the design world was there was so much time spent trying to overanalyze stuff, really. It is important to do research and homework, understand your client, all of that, absolutely. But the creative part of it, there seemed to be less and less and less of that happening. It feels like right now everything, and I left it 12 years ago, and from colleagues that I talked to, they've said it's continued to, everything has to be quantified and qualified kind of to the nth degree. It often, when you would get a great idea in that world, most people would recognize it as a great idea, and then it would go into a committee or a larger group of people, and it would just kind of get, death by 1,000 cuts. It would get watered down and diluted, and then what you end up with is something that has lost the core of that really great idea. That sucks, and I had to get out of that. The other part to this was, again, this has come up already, it's been really interesting actually listening to the previous 3 speakers, and a lot of these themes are coming up over and over again. There needs to be somebody with the overall arching vision, the vision of where is this boat going? Because if there's nobody who's leading it, that's when the art side or the creative side gets lost, disappears on you. I was really lucky when I was in design school. I caught what I affectionately now call a magic window. It was a 3-year program. The first year and a half, we did everything by hand. We hand-rendered typography and did our own paste ups for layout, for mechanical artwork, and all that kind of stuff. And then second year came along, and quite literally, the computers arrived at the same time. And so we were taught both of those skill sets. And one of the things I've realized that happened was we focused on design first. Don't worry about the tools. Focus on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And in our case, it was graphic design. What are you trying to make? And then figure out how do you get it done? What are the tools that you're going to need to do it? And often it was interesting because there was this real tension with us between how well did we know the computer, how well, and that would often dictate what we would do. And all of a sudden in that second year, everything starts looking the same as our understanding of software, that whatever that curve was, as that is changing, everybody's got these god-awful, rainbow gradations. That was a pretty early thing in Illustrator, and everybody was in love with it. And so that was everywhere. It's people stopped designing first and then figuring out how do you accomplish what it is that you're after. The other thing that has happened a little bit is, especially for people who are in industrial design or where you are doing 3-dimensional tangible things, that computer seems to have interrupted a little bit of that experience of actually doing stuff. I've got a colleague that I met a number of years ago who used to teach at Ontario College at OCAD, and he was a first-year industrial design teacher. And he was sort of lamenting that one of his first-year projects was always a garbage can, and all the students had to design and build a garbage can. And he said, they assigned it the same way he'd always done for years, and everybody jumped on a computer. They've got this huge facility, or at the time they had this huge facility full of blocks of foam and electric knives and all sorts of other stuff. He said not a single student would go in there, grab a chunk of foam, and just start cutting, start shaping, start making something. Nobody took a piece of paper and twirled it into a cone to facilitate what a garbage can could look like. Everybody went onto a computer. Partway through, as he was becoming more and more stressed about this, he said, you realize that you actually have to produce a physical garbage can for this assignment. And a number of the students said, oh yeah, it's fine. We emailed all of our CAD drawings to a mock-up house and they're going to make it for us. And he kind of said, that's not really the assignment. Like, and what he was so frustrated with was there was a real disconnection between the act, all those little magical things that can happen when you're manipulating something and actually making something. You often can get insight into stuff that you don't get when you're working in a two-dimensional world, especially when you're working, the end result is a three-dimensional object. That being said, I love the computer too. Like, that's a quick SketchUp drawing I did of our living room. It was a very quick way for me to get a sense, because the scale and the scope of it was quite large, and for me to just mock that up. Same thing with the herringbone floor. I did it in Adobe Illustrator, did the entire floor, moved the pattern up and down, left and right to try and figure out where everything would lay out properly. So I don't want to sound like I'm trashing computers at all, or technology. It's just that it's a tool. And in some cases, it is the best tool, but it's not the only tool. There are other things out there that can bring value and other insight into stuff. So I want to talk a little bit, and I'll try and get through this quickly. I've got a lot of images, and I want to get to the workbench. All of life experience kind of goes into a great big pot. And this is a shot of me when I was 11 or 12 years old, hand-picking tomatoes at my uncle's farm. My mom grew up on a farm, and her attitude was, no kid of mine is not going to know how to work. And so every year we went for 2 weeks and worked on one of her brother's farms. And at the time, it sucked. But in hindsight, I learned an awful lot about it. One, the value of hard work and the reward of sleeping really well at night because of hard work. But the other thing that I learned was, when you're standing on a 2-kilometer row of tomatoes with a whole bunch of other people, and you're staring down this huge, daunting task, and you put your head down, and you've got these baskets, and you start picking a tomato, and you put it in the basket, and you're going for a few minutes, and you look up, and everybody else is 30 feet down, and you're still 5 feet in. You really quickly learn what you're doing wrong. You're not working efficiently. And so you get off the one hand you're leaning on, and you start using 2 hands. And you start thinking about the way that you're moving or not moving, and you start working more efficiently as you're going. So the first day, I might have filled 25 baskets. And most of the other people who were very, very efficient at it, they'd be doing 150, 200 baskets in a day. And it was embarrassing, because I was every bit as exhausted as they were. By the end of the week, I got up to 102, and I will never forget 102 tomato baskets. It wasn't 150, but I crossed the 100 mark. It was ugly. When I was growing up, I've got 2 sisters, and we didn't have a huge house, and I was running out of space. I was doing a lot of drawing and painting at the time, and so I, told my parents, can I move up into the attic? I came home from school. My dad had, I didn't realize this, taken the day off, and he ripped the roof off because we were putting on an addition. So this goes back to that. Well, maybe not what's the worst that can happen is you screw up, because there's a lot at stake with ripping your roof off. But the whole notion of just being fearless and trying something. And so Dad would work pretty methodically and be conscious of how he was taking it apart, so that gave insight into how to put it back together again. So this is, I'm grateful that I didn't learn my aesthetic sense from my father, because he tended to build, if a 4-inch screw was required, he'd use a 12-inch screw just because. But it did teach me about process and methodology and a manner of organizing your work. There's a bunch of other things. Talking about camping, there is something about getting poured on at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that is when you wake up, you learn how to deal with it, and you move on, and you survive it. And what that does is it builds confidence in your ability to get through something, to get through a crappy situation, come out the other side. And the strange thing is, those are the stories that you tell your kids and you share with the people that you were with. That's what you remember. You remember all those trials and those hardships. So you don't like getting soaked at 2 in the morning, but there is some value to it. I'm also convinced everybody how many people here have worked a retail job? Thank you. I think this should be a mandatory thing, that everybody should work for 1 year in retail across the board, because you learn a lot of things. You're standing behind a counter, you're generally a youngish person, and you have somebody coming up to you. You don't know if they are going to be the nicest person you ever met or a walking nightmare. But you have got to figure out, in that context, of how to serve them, how to help them, how to understand what it is that they're after, and be polite about it. And learning how to do that, I spent all through high school working retail jobs. And it was, again, at the time, it wasn't terribly glamorous, but I learned a lot about how to interact with people, how to feel comfortable with people, and figure out what people want, because a lot of the time, they actually don't know what they want. And you need to be able to read between the lines and figure out, oh, that's sort of what they're saying, and then ask questions that will ideally lead them to come up with the answers, is what you want to have happen. My father-in-law was very successful in business, and he had a story that he shared a long time ago that was very valuable. When he was hiring engineers, he would only hire engineers that worked on a farm. And the reason for that was, he said, when you work on a farm, you get all sorts of things thrown at you that there is no manual for. You have to learn how to adapt and be creative on the fly, and generally very quickly. And he found that more often than not, when he hired, even if they might not have been as qualified, what he would end up getting was somebody who could think on their toes and have the ability to extrapolate information a little bit better and a little bit easier and come up with better solutions. As all this manual training was going on when I was a kid, there was a little quiet training going on, and that was me drawing. I was a pretty dorky kid and drawing all the time. This is probably the earliest thing that I could find without raiding my mom's supply of all of the childhood artwork stuff. Yeah. This drawing led to painting. This is Large Marge from Pee-wee's Big Adventure that came out in 1985. Great movie if you want to watch it. It was all done with claymation, and I took a Polaroid of it and then painted it because I loved it. This was probably when I realized that there was a connection between drawing or art and the commercial world. This was the cover for a yearbook when I was in high school, and I was asked many times I did a number of the covers when I was in high school, and made the connection, there are people that actually that want people to do artistic work, and it'll be used in a kind of a commercial environment. When I was in college, one of our assignments was to do a hyper-realistic rendering, and this was only with pencil. This, for me, from a kid who had been drawing for 15 years up till now, this satisfied the question of what am I capable of. That was done, I think there's a date on it, 1991. I was 20 years old at the time, and I still look at that. We've got that hanging in our front hallway. I still look at that, and it still does kind of impress me that I did that. It's well done. And so for me, from going to that 80%, 100% thing, there are lots of people who are better drawers than I am. I know that, but just from a very personal level, that satisfied that in me. When I was again in college, I did a co-op term and did some editorial illustration. Again, another commercial application for art, I guess, and creativity. One of our clients that I had when I was working in Toronto in advertising, they were called Northern Credit Union, and they were based in Sault Ste. Marie. They weren't by far our biggest client, but they had some really interesting things about them. Not the least of which was that the people in that organization who were empowered to make decisions actually got to make them. And that's unusual. So the people in charge actually could do what they thought was best. So we had a client who really bought in to what it is that we do, what we were going to do for them, and he trusted us to know what we were doing. Did everything from logo development to tagline to all their promotional work, internal and external. And the tagline that we came up with for them was natural human resources. The creative director and I spent a week touring, all of their all the branches that they've got. And that's something that really came through, that they are a resource-based community, all of those little spots. And so we drew upon that. It made sense. But also that they're people, they're human beings, and they wanted to be treated as such. So this was an information kit that we came out for them. That's the inside. One of it was just a promotional piece called Lookout. So we're just using language that would fit well with that environment. We did a contest, not a contest, I guess it was a contest with their members to submit photographs for a calendar that we would produce on their behalf. And that was the photo credit. It was designed loosely to look like a lumber stamp when you buy lumber. So again, trying to make a connection between what their environment was, what their reality is, to make them feel more connected to it, I guess. This is again a couple of shots of our living room. This This is something that I really, really enjoy doing, and again, I've heard it mentioned a few times, is you've got all sorts of parameters for a job. Once you've got all those addressed, that's when you can play. That's when you can have fun. That, all those little dots, that's Morse code. That was the signing of the floor. It says Konrad, Jill, Riley, Lucas, Sauer, 2010. Because I didn't want to do a great big signature, so I wanted to come up with a creative way of how do I identify this? This is our home. And we took a lot of time, a lot of energy to get it done. So make it personal. Those are the six chairs. I was really lucky that all that wood came from one log, enough for 6 chairs and enough for the dining room table as well. That's a prototype of a coffee table that was started off as a sketch, and it was a mock-up that went a little bit too far into a finished coffee table. About 20 years ago, I started making furniture. It was, as I said before, it was a great creative outlet to actually get back to using my hands and making stuff again. And that hand plane was my great undoing. That's about 100 years old, and it was made by hand in Scotland. And when I got that, it knocked the socks off anything else I'd ever used. And it made no sense to me, because it's a pretty plain, pretty bland-looking thing. And so, like the idea of making your own furniture, well, I got to make my own tools to do what I want them to be able to do. And that was about 13 years ago, and it has now turned into a full-time career for me for the last 12 years. So these are, I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. So these are some of the planes that I've made over the years. It's an unusual wood called snakewood, and it actually looks like that. That's a weird variant of ebony, where the heartwood and sapwood are kind of confused as to where they're supposed to grow. That's made of boxwood, which, you know, boxwood hedges, if you leave them alone for 500 years, they turn into lumber. That's an African wood called pink ivory, which is a pretty, actually that plane is sitting up here. It's a pretty electric pink. I think that one's up here too. More boxwood. So I'm going to go through this really quick just because I'm running short on time here. So a lot of a design approach that I've realized that I'm going through was born out of the advertising side of things when we were doing stuff. I'll run through this rather quickly. Identify the need of the problem, either one that you generate yourself if you're doing something for yourself, or obviously from the client. And as I said before, learning how to fill in the gaps of what your client brief is, because oftentimes they may not exactly know, they know what the problem is, but they're not quite sure how to get there. And so you have to it takes a long time, and I'm still learning how to do this. Read between the lines of what it is they're saying, what they really might want, or really want. And ask questions based on your perspective and your life experience. And this was, again, something that I learned in the ad world. We would always go to a client meeting with an art director, a writer, and a project manager, because we all hear different things as we're getting a brief. And so we would go back and kind of do a post-mortem just on an initial brief and go, man, I didn't even pick up on that or hear on that. And so we would pool all of what we heard. It was way better at stitching together, trying to figure out exactly what it is that we need to do for our client. Why have previous products fallen short? What was missing? Their skills were lacking, were there new materials that are now available, technology has changed, and then define the criteria for that new approach or that new object. In my world, I've often got a lot of what you'd call hard criteria, stuff that has to be there. So dimensions, heights, weights, scale, all of those sorts of things. When you're doing a hand plane, there are parameters that you have to fall within. With a chair, they have to be specific heights, lengths, all of that in order to feel comfortable. So you've got all of those hard facts, or those hard numbers or targets that you've got to hit. But after that is when you get to play. And that's when you get to impart your own touches. That's the art side of things that can make such a big difference, such an impactful difference than when you're interacting with something. Sketching, learn to sketch, learn to draw. And sketches don't need to be like beautiful finished drawings. All it needs to do is remind you of a thought that you had when you go back and review it. It doesn't need to be a perfectly done thing. It can just be a scribble that reminds you of where you were when you were working on something. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm not sure if this is going forward here. So I had a client a number of years ago say to me, I'd made a number of planes for him. His daughter is an art director at a big agency in Toronto, so he knew the buttons to push for me. And he said, that plane is called a panel plane. And he said, I kind of like the size of it, but that's about it. It's kind of clunky, it's kind of big, it's pretty Victorian. I want you to rethink the whole thing. Just redesign the whole thing. His brief was more wood, less metal. I want it to be fast, and I want it to be modern. And that was it. And he said, there's no rush, there's no time constraints, no cost constraints, whatever. Just that's what I want. And he said, take as long as you need. And he left. And he pushed all the right buttons. So that is the design. That is an original design of a 100-year-old plane that was made in England. And that has been the design of that style of plane ever since it came out. It has not changed. So these are planes by 3 different makers, 3 different time periods, and they're all pretty similar in that they've got where the knobs are, all the shapes and the forms and the sides and everything like that. And he'd contact me throughout the year and say, well, have you had any thoughts? No, sorry, Derek. And he said, no problem, just checking in. And I was doing a fairly mundane task. I was doing some filing on a piece of metal, and for whatever reason, lightning struck. And I've got a great big chalkboard in the shop, walked over to it, and just drew. And that's what I drew, that shape. And I kind of drew it, and I walked back to the filing, and I realized I was filing blind, and I thought, I got to take this moment and really and give this justice, because this might actually be something in here. So I took that drawing, grabbed my sketchbook, and just started sketching and sketching and sketching and sketching. And going back to when I was in design school, hand rendering a beautiful curve is so much easier with a pencil than it is to try and do it on a computer. You can get so many more graceful lines really, really fast. So I would oscillate between doing some hand renderings, dump it into the computer, draw over top of it in Illustrator, because again, there are certain lengths I was trying to hit, certain sizes I'm trying to hit. There are fixed points of data that I need. But other than that, so then you'd print that out and you'd trace over top of that again and refine lines. So we're just working back and forth and back and forth. Those are some of the drawings. Screenshot of some of the Illustrator, one of the Illustrator files as I was working on it. That was what I ended up with. So from that computer, and I emailed that to the client, and I said, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? He said, great, keep going. Perfect. Time to do a mock-up. And that's sitting up here. That is so I ran into him at a show. That's what it looks like. I just made it of plywood. But again, because what I'm making is 3-dimensional and the tactile qualities that are so important, this was a really, really crucial stage for me to do. So a bunch of shots of that mock-up. The other thing with this plane that was unique is it's got curved sides. That had never happened before. And it's one of those things that when you see it, you go, duh, it's a stronger shape because of that curve. That metal body is stronger because of it, and it's so much more graceful looking. And a bunch of shots of that mock-up. And I kept him in the loop as I was going, and he said, okay, keep going. This is great, this is great. Time to do it in metal. So there's the metal parts that are made for the shell. Again, taking those same mock-up parts, making sure they still look right, interact properly. That chamfer, I don't know if you can tell, but the edge of that, there's an angle filed on it. That's a really important aesthetic thing that then transitions into the wooden components later on. That was trying to figure out how to best use a piece of material. A lot of the material I work with is very hard to find. It's expensive. I don't want to waste it because it's a really rare material. So you end up with different templates, drawing out different handles, and that's the waist at the top, trying to make sure that I didn't hit any of those bits of wrinkle. That blank handle in a vise, that's all shaped by hand with rasps and files. Further refining it, you can see there's a hand plane. It's kind of ironic that you kind of need a hand plane to make a hand plane. As you're going, again, you're constantly checking the interactions, making sure that things are fitting properly together. So these are some shots kind of partway through the construction, refining some of the details. Again, this was the first one. I had a mock-up there that I thought, I knew that I was on the right track and it was accomplishing what I wanted. But once you actually are making the real prototype, it can get a little bit harried. And I spent a lot of time just looking at it and really thinking about, okay, shaping that front section. The first one doing this one took me hours to do, because you're taking a little bit off and you're interacting with it with your hand, because it has to feel right in order for it to function properly. So that's that white line. That is that chamfer on that body. That angle rolls into the front edge of that part, and that's it shaped. And then there's a bunch of shots here of the finished plane. So one of the things that I wanted to do, along with bringing the chair and invite somebody to sit in it, is if anybody wants, please come up here and actually try one of these. This is part of, for me, what is so enjoyable about the experience of it is being able to interact with tools, being able to use things, and seeing what they do. You're talking about delight and enthrall. There are a lot of people, and I'm probably going to jinx it by saying it, but most people have never used a hand plane. And they grab one and they run it over a piece of wood, and this little shaving that comes out that's 1/1000 of an inch thick, it's pretty bloody cool to be able to do that. It sounds neat, and it's such a tactile experience that we don't get a lot of that. We seem to be getting less and less of that as we're going on. That's why the shovel challenge got thrown out there. Anyway, so if anybody wants, I'm going to see quickly if I can, these should still be tuned up, but so the reason for using a hand plane is, it may seem kind of, oh, actually, there is one slide here that I did want to just mention. So going back to that, a sketch that doesn't have to be pretty, but has to remind you of what it is that you thought. That is the doesn't look right, but that's the curve of that chamfer that rolls across the inside of the front, and then the actual one. So again, it was just there to remind me what exactly is it looking like, or what was I trying to achieve with it. So the reason you use a hand plane is, frankly, to not have to use sandpaper anymore. This is an awful lot more efficient. If you look at early pieces of furniture in museums, all the ones that you go and admire and look at, they were all made by hand, most of them, in the museums at least. And they were all surfaced with hand tools. Most people have a grandfather that probably has one of these, and it was used to do all sorts of really evil things, like get doors unstuck, and so they're full of paint and chips. They work, when they're made or when they're tuned up specifically for woodworking purposes, they can do some pretty cool stuff, like take shavings like that. The shavings are impressive, but really what you're after is the surface quality that you get from this. I've often been to shows, and I have a piece of 600 grit sandpaper in my back pocket, and inevitably somebody says, wow, you wouldn't have to do much sanding with that. Pull out the 600 grit sandpaper and scuff it up, and it dies. The clarity of the wood dies, the color dies, everything dies. Sandpaper kills it. So the reason for that is, if you imagine wood is like a bundle of straws, and sandpaper is rocks glued to paper. You're abrading, you're breaking, you're tearing wood fibers. A hand plane is an edge, like a knife edge, held in a fixed position, taking a continuous cut. You are shearing off the fibers, which is why old pieces of furniture look so amazing, because all those fibers have been sheared, not broken, ragged. And you get a much better sense of clarity out of the wood. Yeah, anyway. So if I'm going to have this bench this evening at the museum, as well as the hand planes. So please, if you're interested, I would love it if you wanted to come and try it out there. You're also welcome to come and try it out now if you'd like. I think most of these are all tuned up and ready to go. So this friend, a customer of mine, made me this hammer for adjusting planes. It's a very, very cool community of people that are into this. So let me just make sure these are all working. So I think that is probably it, as far as I realize it's run over a little bit. Yeah. There you go. So please feel free to come up and try it out.